then I will have to unmute myself at least. We've been doing this for a year now, and still it's it's not always easy. Then we're going to Iceland. We will meet Hildur Fjóla Antonsdóttir, who is postdoctoral researcher at Edda Research Center, University of Iceland. Hi, Hildur.
Hi, Hildur.
Hi. And you have, I mean, you heard where we ended the last session before the break. And this dream about another way of doing these things, and also a dream that is opening up for another way of thinking these concepts, not only through criminal justice. And that is actually what you've been working on.
Yes, exactly. That's kind of what I was working on in my PhD thesis, trying to understand, kind of rethink kind of what does justice mean when it comes to sexual violence, and kind of following in the footsteps of some researchers that have been increasingly looking at the meaning of justice from the perspectives of victim survivors of sexual violence themselves, and how victim survivors kind of conceptualize and understand justice. And then trying to take that then a step further and trying to think about, okay, so if we have some idea how the victims understand justice, how can we kind of operationalize that or use that as a way of finding ways to make systems more accountable to victims.
And you have been looking into some very specific parts here, is talking about standalone civil law tort suits as another approach to this topic.
Yes, exactly. So I'm looking at kind of different aspects, both procedural justice, tort law, complaint mechanisms and complaint procedures. But yes, in the talk today, I was looking at the tort option and looking at, is it possible to develop that option in a way that could better meet the justice interests of victim survivors of sexual violence? Because one of the key issues in tort law, or in private law, so-called private law, is this issue about the standard of proof, because the standard of proof, at least in practice, is lower than in criminal law, and kind of the standard legal reasoning for why so few cases end in a guilty verdict from the legal perspective is usually, because of insufficient evidence. So how about looking at other possibilities of obtaining legal recognition then, within the law, but not kind of going through the criminal justice system necessarily.
And what did you find?
Well, firstly, I can say that I found that for most victims, they do not think that tort law is a palatable option, not as it stands, and for different reasons. First of all, very practical reasons of not being able to finance a lawsuit. It can be very expensive to embark upon a private lawsuit. And that's also a question of, it's also a sense of unfairness. It's not fair that victims have to kind of pursue their own legal cases. And then another issue was this issue of monetary compensation, because, if you are successful in a private suit, like a tort suit, then it's about monetary compensation. And they most had great problems of kind of accepting that as any kind of compensation for sexual violence.
Yeah, you talk about taboo trade-offs.
Yes, taboo trade-offs, that's a concept that I borrowed and kind of use in the study. And taboo trade-offs refers to this trade-off when we are trading public goods or values like love or honor or justice for monetary or for money. And this is something that in many societies is regarded as highly problematic and can even kind of undermine people's moral position. So if you're going after monetary compensation instead of justice, then this might even mean that you don't really have a case, that you're only after the money. And that was very much something that came up in the interviews with victim survivors, that they felt that even as in the Nordic countries, you know, when you report a case to the police and you're going through the criminal justice process, then you have the option of putting in the compensation claim that is then dealt with in the criminal justice process, and most victims do that. And many of them talked about how uncomfortable they were putting in a compensation claim because they felt that that was somehow undermining their case, that somehow they would not be believed as much if they
she's lying.
Yeah,
she's
lying. Yeah. She's after the money. Yeah.
And you talk about dirty money.
Yes, exactly. And that's kind of touches upon this kind of moral aspect of receiving money for justice. And that is, and coming from the offender, it's understood as dirty money. So now I've just paid her for it, so now she should be fine, you know, and even equating it with prostitution, like one participant did. So there is kind of a very problematic kind of reference in people's minds when it comes to money in this context. Yeah.
And we started off by talking about Kajsa Ekis Ekman and her article in Klassekampen, the Norwegian daily, where she asks for harder punishments. But you have also looked into that in a way, because you have asked also what is it actually that you want? What is it that you somehow, what can even this out as harm?
Right. So for victims, survivors of sexual violence, and I'm not saying, you know, there are many people are as different as there are many. So I'm not saying that everybody thinks that, or like many victims think that a guilty verdict in a criminal case is important, and it's also very much considered to be symbolically important. And it can also be considered important if people think it's going to prevent the offender to re-offend. You know, at least he's in prison, so he's not going to re-offend while he's in prison, right? So that's very often the way the people I talked to thought about it. But in terms of punishment, not many people really talked about it in those terms, that what they were after was punishment. It was much more about offender accountability, offender responsibility, that offenders would realize what they had done, would offer a sincere apology, would change their ways, would work on their issues, would go into therapy, would somehow improve themselves to ensure that they would never do this again. So that was much more kind of along those lines that people talked about justice.
Just shortly in the end, before we will invite in the others, what policy implications do you see?
Well, I think if we kind of take this seriously and we try to kind of amend or change the systems that we already have to better meet victims' justice interests, it would be possible to then provide victims of sexual violence legal aid, paid for by the state, to pursue private cases, and then also offer state guarantees of awards if awards are made, to ensure that victims would get the compensation. But then I think we might want to also take this a step further and to see how can we use this system to incentivize offenders to take responsibility for their actions, because as it stands, the legal system doesn't really do that in a sense. So here it would be possible for the state to come in, and then the offender would owe the state money, and then the state could incentivize offenders to undergo an accountability process or something similar to that.
That is a little bit in line with what Katrine talked about from Denmark. I mean, if you put that into the context of the youngsters with, yeah, that you don't even feel, you don't know that you've done something wrong.
Right. Exactly. No, absolutely.
I have to invite in all the others, so we have some time to talk about all these very interesting keynotes and findings. I want to ask you, Maj-Lene, when you heard when you heard Stina talks about how they see the Swedish numbers, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, of course, register figures are registered figures. They represent what at any given point is reported to the police, and that reflects societal norms, legal thresholds, and trust in the police. And it does so in all countries, and of course, that differs. But so I don't have an opinion about the amount of rape going on in Sweden. I'm just interested in the responses that happens in Swedish debate when someone says something about figures. The amount of the phenomenon, what kind of rapes and who commit rapes is something that grabs headlines in Sweden in a way that doesn't really happen elsewhere. So my interest lies in the meaning of the register, the meanings applied to the figures.
And why do you think Sweden discussed this in another way?
So there are both the fact that as a kind of a gender equality haven, they should have fewer rapes than other people, other countries. So therefore, many rapes, high levels of rape, increasing levels of rape, if that would be correct, that would be harmful to the reputation of Sweden. Sweden, who are very active on the global arena as a general gender equality maverick. So that would damage the brand. But also in relation to domestic debates, because this happens at the same time as crimes generally are going down in the Nordics. The numbers of sexual violations goes up, and then what is happening, and the interpretation, as I said earlier about the interpretation that the Swedish Democrats applies, saying that if Swedish feminists are right, rape happens because of patriarchal norms and lack of gender equality norms. The general Swedish population are very much dedicated to gender equality norms, as Stina pointed to. The social survey data shows much lower support for rape myths. If the numbers are increasing, then it has to do with the population. It has to do with who does the raping. That would be the argumentation of the Swedish Democrats, saying that that migrants are coming to the country from Muslim majority countries that is not socialized into gender equality norms, are not socialized into combating rape myths. So high rape figures would give ammunition to the Swedish Democrats, and it would be given ammunition to anti-feminism. So that's why it becomes so important to address the figures. So that's very interesting in itself.
Yeah, it is. And what's your response to that, Stina? And now you have to unmute, I see.
Well, I agree with Maj-Lene that the discussion, the media debate and the political debate about rape is often linked to this debate about immigration. And as I understand from Maj-Lene, that is not so much the case in the other Nordic countries. But we have a very strong debate about immigration in Sweden at the moment, so that it flavors, so to say, all debates in Sweden today.
But Katrine, since you have been talking about myths and the value myths, what's your take on this discussion?
Well, the one with the ethnicity, whether ethnicity is a part of
this paradox, if it is like that when we have a higher gender equality standard on debate, then you could see that reflected in the numbers. And if the numbers are as they are right now, because they're rising, it has to be connected to the patriarchal way of thinking about sexuality.
I think it's not I wouldn't say it's an either or just a straight answer. I think there are some ways, like Maj-Len and Stina already talked about. There are first of all, there are the practice on how you register things in the registries at the police. There are the normative boundaries for what you think is sexual violence in legal terms. That changes all the time. Like now we have in Denmark a consent-based law, so new ways of understanding what sexual violence is changes. I don't know if that was what you were after. I'm not sure.
No, I'm also thinking about this. We have this notion that the Nordics are very high up on these parameters in gender equality, and when then we also have this notion of being liberal, and we see that numbers are rising.
I just think it's because, as I said before when we talked, that I don't think that gender equality necessarily has transmission into the sexual domain, really. So we might be gender equal in a lot of ways, the labor market, equal pay, maybe in some ways still equal access, free speech. Then there is the sexual domain. How does it look there? What do we consider equality in a heterosexual context? A lot of the young people that I talk to, particularly the boys, they describe seeing pornography, which is really, really far from what we would consider consensual sex. It is pornography on porn sites where there are rape, violence, incestuous relationships, sexual abuse, all these kind of present on a porn site are presented as sex, and nobody there to comment on whether this is okay behavior or not. And at the same time, they, at least in Denmark, they don't have any fixed amount of hours of sex education, so they don't really discuss these ideas but they exist among them, so they only have each other to really discuss. And whether you go down the path to gain respect by having non-consensual sex is really dependent on the peers you are with.
And Hildur, when you listen to Katrine now, what do you think about her kind of proposal for dealing with these issues in our countries?
Muted. Yes, in terms of the importance of accelerating the discussion, right? You're talking about that among young people, in terms of kind of better exploring their values and status and all of those things. I think that's tremendously important. I know here in Iceland, we continuously keep talking about the importance of sexual, education, in terms of sexual education for kids and young people. And even if, it's kind of getting better, it's happening in an amazingly slow pace at the same time. And there seems to be some kind of a shortage of people who can actually teach this or kind of facilitate these discussions with kids. So I definitely think that's very important,
Maj-Len?
I just want to say how important I think that we have the kind of research that Katrine is doing. Because typically when rape legislation is discussed, there's a lot of adults, very grown-up people, discussing things as if the question of boundaries in sexuality, as if it is very simple. So the complexity that the respondents in Katrine's research demonstrate shows that these kind of negotiations that takes place is not necessarily expressed or in line with gender norms in society. It becomes an enclave with a different logic. And to take that seriously, I'm not saying, but they're mistaken. If we change the law, they will think differently. I think we have talked differently about rape for several decades. Still, we find this kind of compartmentalized thinking about sexuality. So obviously all the other things aren't necessarily working as we would like them to do. So changing one word in a legal paragraph might also not do the trick of penetrating this enclave of thinking of sexuality. And you mentioned it, Hilde. Sexuality is ambiguous, it's mysterious, it's like, it's existential. So it might not be an area where legislation works very straightforward. So it's important to take it seriously that sexuality is a kind of a very complex social relationship.
Stina? Unmute. You can have it unmuted.
I think it's also important to remember how few of all these people or women who feel that they have been raped that actually report it to the police. Because in our yearly study about MTU, where we ask men and women if they have been victim of a crime, we ask if they have been victim of a crime or a rape also last year. And if we count up what that would mean to the whole population, we think that about 25,000 women say that they have been raped in a year. And that could be compared to about 800 police reports about rape. So, as you were discussing, it's obvious that most women who feel that they have been raped in some sense, they don't go to the police. They don't think that it's something they want to report or go to court with. And I think that perhaps shows a bit about the Danish study, that the negotiation and the feelings about it is quite a lot of separate world to the legal world. It's I would say that it's a very small part of all perceived rapes that lead to a police report.
Daniela, I mean, you have also listened in now. And
I said wrong. 8,000.
8,000. Yeah. But Daniela, you when you also hear now Hilde talking about another way of looking at the crime and another justice there, what do you have any reactions to that?
Well, I think that is very valuable research that Hilde presented there, and something that is perhaps a discussion also not very well developed within the Nordic countries, because most of the Nordic countries do not really have like a similar sort of tort law tradition or these kinds of like compensations in civil procedures as many common law countries, for example. And there is in general a tradition of receiving, for example, much smaller amounts of compensation, and not saying that that is necessarily the best way to go for or the only way. I would say that when talking about civil procedures and compensations, tort law, it is still quite, I mean, it's an important aspect, obviously, this individual liability of the perpetrator, but I would say that there's also a need to sort of broaden the debate and look at sort of what the public responsibility is as well. So I think Hilde was touching upon that as well. But for example, looking to the Istanbul Convention, which is a very important international legal document, there are many important obligations for ratifying states to have other services like victim support services, for example, to have legal aid, to provide education when it comes to gender violence and sexual violence, including sexual violence, psychological support to victims, also very important. So I think the compensation question is one thing, and it is not something also that one should shy away from, because we're talking about monetary compensation, but it is, I would say, one form of possible reparations to victims that can be given, but not the only one, of course.
But Maj-Len, you also talked about punishment, of course, and you don't want to go in the US style here. What's your take on Hildur's presentation?
Very American.
Yeah.
No, so I find this very interesting, because in a Nordic context, the reason why we punish isn't to remedy things for the victim. The main reason is society. So Stina also mentioned the lack of reporting of rape, and also I also write on kind of, there is a research literature on the question of why victims don't report rape, and it might not be because they feel that they don't trust the police or that they are not met with respect. There are a broad range of reasons why people don't turn to the police for this particular things, or all kinds of things. So to discuss alternative avenues for justice, I think, is very important to meet this kind of lack of feeling that the criminal justice system would help or be the kind of right channel. But as a society, we encourage that. As a society, we want to change existing perpetrators. We want to deter future perpetrators, to protect future victims, and to develop societal norms. That's why we punish. So Hildur lays a lot of emphasis on what the victims want. Yeah. And I think that is, of course, important, but it's also important not to lose sight of that it's for us that the punishments exist, not for the victims, or I could also be a victim, of course, but it's for society. So I think it's very, and also it moves away from and of course Hildur points to this, both in the research and in the keynote, they often interpret how this is often interpreted as individualistic. And taking it's a very distinct different avenue. And I follow Marilyn Manson case now, which has to do with where tort law is discussed and applied. So I think that would be a very interesting case to follow in terms of tort law as an alternative.
Hildur.
Yes, thanks to Maj-Len and Daniela for these comments. I just want to kind of reiterate that I do discuss it at some length in the paper that this presentation is based on, of how we can actually make sure that this does not become a privatized option, that indeed that it should be state funded, both in terms of pursuing the case and in terms of guaranteeing the awards and in terms of incentivizing then offenders. So I think that's kind of what I'm trying to talk about, like how can we change or amend or develop this option to better kind of fit under how we understand the violation of sexual violence. So I think in my formulation, it becomes less American, and it also relies more on distributive justice, which is public justice.
Maj-Len?
Yeah, no, I know you are well aware of these things, and I'm just thinking, because the background in the Nordic countries for discussing legislative change is a kind of a dissatisfaction with the way the criminal justice system is currently working. So thinking, okay, the criminal justice system is flawed in terms of how it manages sexual violence, so let's fix the paragraph. But of course, there are lots of other things that can be fixed, and Stina pointed to the kind of improving the quality of prosecution and investigation, and kind of the way the Nordic countries has also focused on increasing kind of knowledge and the speed of the system. Brå has also recently done an evaluation of a trial project in the Stockholm police about that. So there are also other avenues for justice, but also avenues for fixing the criminal justice system that could perhaps be more efficient than fixing the terminology.
Daniela.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on another point that came up in Hildur's presentation as well. Which I think was an important finding, and that sort of also speaks to the values more broadly in the Nordic countries when it comes to like talking about this compensation as dirty money, for example. And I think that is. So it is important what you do to ask sort of what do victim survivors want? But also an important question also to pose is why do we have these, or why are these attitudes when it comes to compensation sort of so persistent in the Nordic countries? And to me, it seems a little bit now, I'm sort of mainly throwing out a hypothesis, but there seems to me almost as there is sort of a way to talk about compensation sort of without recognition of the violation, sort of, and not as a sort of complementary means to redress victims and to have both this sort of recognition and compensation, that there is sort of a juxtaposition between the two, whilst they're not, I mean, at least from a transitional justice perspective, for example, they're not in opposition, they're not mutually exclusive to one another. Now, I'm not saying that you said this, Hildur, but maybe that there is perhaps this sort of understanding of compensation, which is more cultural within the Nordic countries, or many of the Nordic countries.
I don't know if you want to comment on that, Hildur?
Yes, maybe just briefly. Well, I think, yes, because in tort lawsuits, of course, it's not only a question of compensation. There is also, of course, a verdict, right? There is a verdict that that the behavior that was that is in question was wrong, right? And created harm. So it is about the wrong and harm of sexual violence. So there is this legal recognition of that, therefore. So it's not like compensation is somehow devoid of that kind of moral assessment. And also, just to pick up on what Maj-Len was saying, I absolutely agree. And that's, you know, in terms of my thesis, I was looking at like, how do we understand justice in a broader sense? So I'm not only talking about the tort law can fix everything, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it's more about looking at many different avenues of how we can kind of look beyond or decenter criminal justice a little bit in our kind of imaginary space of justice, because as it is now, it's almost like we cannot think beyond criminal justice when it comes to justice in case of sexual violence. So what I'm kind of suggesting is that we kind of venture a little bit beyond it as well, and not only look at criminal justice, but look at justice potential in a broader sense. Not doing away with criminal justice, not at all. Keep working on that, but not maybe at the expense of kind of not thinking about anything else.
Maj-Len.
Yeah, no, it's just in terms of thinking of the alternatives. So in the Norway and Sweden, we have one alternative, negligent rape, which is a way of lowering the thresholds of evidence and lowering the kind of needs to demonstrate an intent and knowledge on the part of the perpetrator. And these are paragraphs that are used very rarely. Stina described it in the period they investigated. It was applied 11 times. Also in Norway, we've had it much longer. Isn't really applied. One goes straight for a rape prosecution, which has a very high threshold because it has a strong long penalty. It has to have in a rule of law country, it has to have a very high threshold, and it's very difficult to prove that this happened. So to go for negligent rape could be an alternative that would give the victim rights, make his or her case heard, and given a verdict. But the systems and the victims perhaps in Norway and Sweden seem very hesitant to use that alternative, and that's very interesting because that's a lower threshold.
Stina and then Katrine.
Well, I would not recommend a wider use or more of careless rape, and I would say that it's the police and the prosecutor who decides whether they should call it a rape or a careless rape. So it's not the person who reports, I would say. But I think the discussion about what means we could use to help victims better than we do today, and to build them up, because we will always have the fact that at least 80% of those who report rape will not see the person get a punishment for it. So we have to also find other ways. I think that's very important, to see other ways to help the victim. In Sweden, we have both the criminal justice system and compensation. They are linked together. So you can apply at the Authority for Crime Victim Compensation when you have a verdict, and then you get the victim gets 100,000 Swedish kronor. So that's the highest crime victim compensation in the legal system. And I would say to you, Hildur, that I feel a bit hesitant, or I might have misunderstood it, to use compensation in the tort system as an alternative to compensation within the criminal justice system, because I think it's very important that there are a legal case with a proof valuation when it comes to compensation, because you have to look at, for legal certainty is very important in these cases.
If we can keep it a little bit short, first Katrine, Daniela, and Hildur, because I want to bring in another topic before we end the session. But Katrine?
There was just a comment to the idea about negligent rape, and I think from drawing on the perspectives from the young women that I interviewed who've been raped, so for them the single most important thing, I think, that they at least described to me in terms of justice was really the acknowledgement. So having the state say you did something you didn't know about would not really be a recognition for them, because all of them felt that the men or boys were very much aware of what they were doing. They were taking an opportunity. So they may not think of themselves as rapists or what they were doing as rape. They were just taking the chance and an opportunity that arose in a situation. And I think for the young women, it was important to be acknowledged at taking that opportunity was at the expense of their sense of dignity as equal human being in the situation.
Daniela.
Yes, so just really briefly, I think in terms of picking up on what was said in terms of recognition, I also think that perhaps there might be a difference between these sort of symbolic value of the recognition when comparing a criminal procedure and a sentence and a civil procedure, and that might be something to sort of think about. And also in the criminal law context, the amount of recognition, if I understood you, Katrina, correctly, that it's also interesting to sort of pose the question of whether or what amounts of or how victims are recognized in intentional rape versus a negligent rape.
Hildur.
Yeah, just a comment to Stina's comment about the compensation possibility. In all the Nordic countries, victims are allowed to file compensation claim within the criminal case and have that assessed if the case goes to court. But what I have been thinking most about is all these cases that never get to court. Most cases in Iceland and in the Nordic countries, in case of rape, never even get to court. So it's not really a question of, should I do a standalone compensation case, or should I report the case to the police? For most people, of course, they report, those who do report or pursue a legal avenue, they go to the police, but their case gets dropped. So it's about providing an alternative way to recognition, after your case gets dropped. So that's the idea. And also, if I was the state, then I would probably say, I will offer legal aid in cases of standalone compensation or tort cases, only if the case has been reported to the police. So first you would probably exhaust that avenue, and if then your case gets dropped, then you have this other avenue. So it's about increasing the possibility of recognition and also create choices, of course.
We're talking about, of course, the victim here, and we have touched upon the consent laws in Denmark and also in Sweden. And I was wondering whether any of you want to comment upon Stina's slight worrying whether the legal protection for those who are reported but acquitted is sufficiently strong. And the boys that she talks about, the mothers of the boys calling in and saying, this is my boy is so stigmatized right now. And also probably some of the boys you're talking about, Katrine, boys who act in a society with norms that are kind of probably not the best sexual norms, but still they are the norms for the youngsters. Do any of you want to talk a little bit about the boy here? Maj-Len, I'm looking at you.
Of course. No, but because rape is a very serious crime with a very strict punishment. To smash someone's face in Oslo in the middle of the night would go nowhere near the kind of punishments you get when you're talking about rape. We have a high lower threshold for high minimum sentencing, high maximum, and we operate also with a normal punishment. So once this is reported and goes to, or is taken seriously, it's seen to be a possible rape, this is very serious for the boy or man or woman or girl in question. So to be accused of rape is really serious, not only in legal terms that you risk high penalties, but as Stina pointed to, the social ramifications are massive if this gets out. And lots of violations happen in situations where many young people are together. So other people can have some knowledge about this might be a possible rape, etc. So even when cases don't go to court or are not reported to the police, suspected violations is something that can really damage someone's lives. So I think that is a really important perspective here. I saw a small note in the newspaper the other day here in Norway, where a 16-year-old boy is reported for rape, is accused of rape. I'm thinking, okay, a 16-year-old boy, if this goes to court and he's convicted, his life will be very much kind of very heavily impacted. But also if he's acquitted, to put a young boy, I don't know anything about that case. It was very few details, but the kinds of things that also possible accused perpetrators go through in this process, having to reconsider the whole way of relating to other people around them react to what they are suspected of having done. And we know that many of the cases that are dropped or acquitted could have fit the legal definition of rape, but the evidence isn't strong enough. So even when they are acquitted, they will risk forever being associated with having committed a rape. There's really no way around that. We saw that with the Hemsedal case in Norway. Being acquitted doesn't really help. So we really need to think in terms of the seriousness of the crime of rape when we discuss what we should do with it, but also not only in terms of the victim, but for society and also perpetrators who have actually perpetrated.
Katrine.
I very much agree with the perspectives presented. I think it's a very serious crime to be charged with. At the same time, I also saw that some of the young women and men, they had friends, not many, but some had friends who've been charged with this. And according to their peer group, they felt very sorry for the boy. So it was not as stigmatizing for that boy. It was more a matter of not believing the girl who would actually reported the abuse or the potential abuse to the police. So I think the ramifications of this will differ in terms of what kind of context you move in. And I think just to bring in a series very popular in Denmark now is Exit, The Norwegian series.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've overseen that, but that is a kind of a good example of some cultural values and some practice in the sexual domain that comes along, which are very different from other people who might other cultural groups in Norway, perhaps.
Yeah, but to become a little bit personal and the last minutes, I have two teenagers at home. Both of them know they have lots of friends who have experienced rape or sexual violence at some sort. And I have I believe them because I even have one on the door here in the middle of the night. And it is something there, again, as you say, Katrina, you find it in the youth culture as well. And in the popular culture, as in the series of Exit or whatever, or Snabba Cash or whatever you look at these days, it is massively there. So that is also, I mean, it is as if there are two very different discussions. One in this kind of in the feminist agenda society, and then you have what is happening in youth culture. Hildur.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with you, Hilda and Katrina. I think the stigma question is something that girls are usually suffering from a lot, because indeed most cases never even get to court. So it's always then a question of if they were lying, right? But also just one question that I wanted to kind of ask. I was thinking, you know, if it becomes possible to increase recognition of sexual violence through both criminal justice systems, but also other avenues, if there's more recognition and therefore more people, mostly men and boys, who will then become responsible for sexual violence, what does that do to stigma? You know, will the stigma be as high, or will it change in some way? You know, if like we say, we probably all know women who have been subjected to sexual violence, but many of us maybe don't know any offenders. But if increasingly we become to know more offenders, if offenders are part of our lives, our brothers, our fathers, our friends and partners, etc., how do we, you know, what becomes of stigma then? How does that work?
If any of you want to have a last word on that, that will be the ending note. Maj-Len.
No, I think what Hildur referred to is also how in our time, due to not only to Me Too, but the kinds of social movements that have gone on for several decades, had made it easier to turn up at someone's doorstep to tell they have been raped. It had made it possible to tell friends and to report to the police or use other avenues. But to stand forward and say you have violated someone is very much taboo. And I'm not saying that it's not like it should be kind of heralded to stand forward and talk a lot about it, but there is also a problem with not hearing the voices of perpetrators in understanding what we can do about the phenomenon. So I think that is...
I hope that will be the conference next year. It's a very good topic there, and we can perhaps end there. Perhaps also someone has got new ideas on what to work on the next year. And hopefully we can meet again, and not in a digital screen, but in a physical room. That is what we all wish for right now. But thank you very much. It has been a delighting 2 hours. I have learned a lot, at least, and good luck with your research wherever you are in the Nordics. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.